So we're going to start off part 2 today of Unit 1 by looking at this most likely exceptionally unacceptable cover of a magazine called Judge. This is from June of 1899. And on the cover here, we have William McKinley dressed in a bathing suit, and yeah, that's actually men's bathing suits from back in the day, holding this screaming, savage-looking devil child, where he is scrubbing it, much to the child's unhappiness, kind of like when I got to give my son a shower occasionally. And it's called The Filipino's First Bath. And in the background, you can see Cuba and Puerto Rico, who are all nice and sparkly and shiny clean now that they've had their first baths. And they're all happy. Look at them. And they're wearing their USA looking pajamas. They got a big hat here to put on. And pretty soon that's going to be the Filipino baby. Now, I'm just telling you right now, I know a lot of people from the Philippines. I've never seen anybody that looks remotely like this. But there's a very interesting context to this. So obviously this is taking place in Washington, D.C., because you can see the Capitol building in the background. McKinley is standing in a river with the waters of civilization, cleansing and bathing the uncivilized heathen child. There's a very direct reference here to the idea of baptism and John the Baptist cleaning the uncivilized of their sins and preparing them for the new life in the world to come. And that's really sort of the implication of this. And this picture kind of sums up what it is that we're going to be really dealing with in part 2. The United States moving itself into a whole new area and territory that it had never explored before this. So where are we going to start with this baby? Well, first of all, let's look at the election of 1896. The election of 1896 sees a very divided Democratic Party. Yes, they had won in 1892. Grover Cleveland had won handily in 1892. And, Grover Cleveland had guided the country through an economic crisis. He was the president who oversaw the 1893 World Expo. He had helped guide U.S. policy relating to other countries. He expanded the Monroe Doctrine. Altogether, the country was in great shape. But this wasn't good enough for the Democrats. Cleveland was disgusted with his own party and had basically flatly refused to run again and walked away from his party's thought process of nominating him. They tried. He refused to do it. Northern and Eastern Democrats were the conservative Democrats, like Cleveland. They favored the gold standard. It was the Western and Southern Democrats who were big on the idea of the bimetallic standard. They were the ones who were really looking at the fact that even though the Democrats won the election of 1892, the populists had gotten votes that they felt should have been Democrat, and they were trying to figure out how to get those votes. The Democratic convention in Chicago turned really ugly. And in the end, conservative Democrats were so disgusted with the push on the part of the liberal progressive Democrats that they actually walked out and refused to participate. This is what led to the eventual choice for the Democratic candidate. After 3 rounds of voting, it was really clear that nobody was going to secure 2/3 majority. And this led to a quandary. None of the candidates being proposed really worked or fit the bill here. In steps 36-year-old congressman from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan, a fairly normal-looking dude, a.k.a. Cross of Gold Man. Now, Bryan was from Nebraska, one of the most unremarkable places in the entire country. At 36 years old, he was literally the youngest man to ever run for president. He's only 1 year older than the bare minimum requirement for age. And the first 3 rounds, nobody took him seriously at all. But by round 4, he began making his presence felt. Now, there's 2 reasons for this. Number one, the Gold Democrats, that's the conservative Democrats, basically walked out and refused to participate. Number 2, Brian is an incredibly gifted public speaker. It's his superpower. He's convincing, he's passionate, he's bold. He has a presence about him that very few other people had when it came to public speaking. And he used this to his advantage. During the first 3 rounds, when nobody had ever even heard of him, even most Democrats didn't know who he was, he made the rounds at the convention, meeting people, talking to them, getting to know them, telling them his ideas. So by round 4, he got more support. And by round 5, he had achieved 2/3 of the remaining eligible voters at the Democratic convention to win the nomination. And his nomination featured a speech that he gave that is one of the most memorable, well-known, and truly impassioned epic speeches in American history. It is known as the Cross of Gold. It's a speech talking about those people who favor the gold standard and comparing them and the gold standard itself to the cross that Jesus Christ was crucified on. And that these gold people were like the Romans who crucified Christ. And that the silver standard and the Americans who supported the silver standard were like Christ. They were being martyred for the truth. It's an amazingly epic speech that has moments in it that are just a complete total bucket of what the heck whack. You guys will be reading that, by the way, so please pay attention to it. It's actually very accessible. It's not really overly complicated language, but he says some pretty inflammatory things. Now, on the flip side, you have the Republicans, who have no problem choosing their candidate. Ohio Senator and stand-in for the undead, William McKinley. William McKinley was the 4th president, or the 4th Republican nominated, who was from Ohio. Grant was originally from Ohio. Rutherford B. Hayes was from Ohio. James Garfield was from Ohio. Benjamin Harrison from Ohio. So he's technically the 5th Ohio president. That is because back in the day, it was not the politicians who ran the parties. It wasn't even the president who was the head of his own party. Instead, there were bosses of the party. And the boss of the Republican Party was a dude who looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. An Ohio businessman, an investor named Mark Hanna. And Mark Hanna was hand-choosing all of these candidates for the Republican Party. The Republicans run on a very straightforward platform. Strong currency, as in a gold standard, and high protective tariffs. The Republicans outspent the Democrats 5-1. So that means that for every dollar of campaign advertising money that the Democrats put in, the Republicans put in 5. And McKinley's campaign strategy was actually brilliant in its simplicity. He stayed home. If you wanted to hear McKinley, every Sunday he would come out on his front porch at his home in Ohio and give a little talk and maybe have a glass of lemonade with you and just chit-chat for a while. He was staying home instead of going out traveling because his wife had epilepsy. It's a seizure disorder. So instead of campaigning, he stayed home to take care of his wife. And this is how he was sold to the American people. In the same way that McKinley stays home to care for his beloved wife, he will be there for the American people. He will be the caring, devoted spouse for Lady Liberty. William Jennings Bryan was dangerous, according to the Republicans. His ideas were radical, and he was going to cause division. He was an enemy to democracy. He was a threat to the existence of America. Now, in the campaign itself, Bryan was actually not just nominated by the Democrats. He was nominated by 3 parties altogether. Democrats nominated him. The populists, realizing what the Democrats were trying to do in terms of pulling votes away from their party, nominated him too. And there is a fringe group of Republicans who nominated him as well. They are called the Silver Republicans. They want the silver standard, the bimetallic standard, using silver, not gold, to back up the currency. McKinley was backed by an alliance or an arrangement of people who were businessmen, wealthy industrialists, skilled union workers, and upper middle class farmers. Bryan was supported by unskilled workers, lower and poor class people, rural farmers in the remote areas, and the general citizens of the western states. Bryan painted a picture of McKinley as being a puppet for Mark Hanna. That the Republican Party boss just pulled the strings and McKinley would dance however he wanted him to, like a marionette. And Bryan, unlike McKinley, got on a train and crossed the country giving speeches, particularly loads and loads of speeches in the 4 swing states. Now, where Bryan runs into trouble is that when it comes to talking about the gold standard and the issue of gold, he's all over that. But when it comes to talking about anything else, he really can't do that. Mark Hanna, who really controlled a lot of influence over newspapers, which the newspapers were staunchly Republican back then, had the newspapers shift the focus of the election from the issue of gold and silver to the issue of tariffs and potential international problems. Bryan had very little influence or understanding of these things, whereas McKinley, if you guys remember, had actually been the author of the McKinley Tariff, the highest tariff of the 19th century. McKinley could very easily talk about these things. And so, rather than allowing the Democrats to dictate the terms of what the election was about, the Republicans shifted it away through the use of the media and what it was that McKinley was actually good with and would talk about. And in the end, the election, oh, by the way, William McKinley, Sam the Eagle from the Muppets. Sam is actually based on William McKinley. Notice the puffy eyes and the steely, like, unibrow look, plus the seriousness. The Republicans easily win the election. But the real takeaway from the election is that the election of 1896 is in many ways the very first modern-style election. The Republicans campaigned on a business prospectus. They, instead of relying on private donations from individuals, Mark Hanna went to big businesses and bankers and said, look, it's better for you if my Billy McKinley wins, rather than Billy Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is going to cause problems. McKinley is going to bring prosperity. And how much is that prosperity worth to you? Mark Hanna got banks and businesses to actually donate money to McKinley's campaign. And he basically went on a strategy of whatever Hannah was good at, or whatever, Brian was good at, is what they shifted the conversation away from and shifted it over to the things that McKinley was good at. In the end, McKinley wins by over 600,000 popular votes and 95 more electoral college votes. It's a pretty significant victory. McKinley, for his part, in his inaugural address, and it's the first inauguration, by the way, actually filmed, even though it's silent, because the film couldn't record voices back then. It is still filmed. McKinley promises, in his role as the 25th president, to bring prosperity and to stay out of foreign affairs. Prosperity will come from the gold standard and from tariffs. This whole issue of foreign affairs. Why bring this up? Well, it's because McKinley sees the writing on the wall. And he begins to recognize that within the very near future, a few years maybe, we are going to end up in a war. And he's trying to put that out there, that the United States is not going to be the one to start the war, but we will definitely finish the war when it comes. So we'll talk about this tomorrow, but you're okay for this part. So peace and love.